I still remember the exact moment my husband looked at me across the dinner table and chose his mother's side, because that was the moment everything I believed about my marriage quietly collapsed. The room smelled like roasted chicken and rosemary, the same Sunday dinner I had been cooking for nearly 35 years, and the long oak table in our Connecticut home looked exactly the way it always had, polished, familiar, dependable. For most of my life I believed that a home could hold a family together the same way walls hold up a roof. I was wrong. My name is Margaret Collins, I'm 68 years old, and until that night I thought I understood the people sitting around that table. My husband Daniel sat across from me with his hands folded in front of him, his posture stiff in a way that made him look more like a stranger than the man I had married when I was 22. To his right sat his mother, Eleanor Collins, 81 years old, small and delicate-looking with perfectly styled silver hair and a calm expression that never seemed to change no matter what was happening around her. Anyone who didn't know her would have assumed she was simply a sweet elderly woman enjoying dinner with family. I knew better, although at that moment I hadn't yet realized just how much better. The tension in the room had been building slowly over the past few weeks, like pressure gathering before a storm that everyone senses but no one wants to acknowledge. It started after Eleanor moved into our home the previous winter. At first it seemed temporary, just a practical decision after she sold her townhouse in New Jersey. Daniel said it would only be for a few months while she decided where she wanted to live next. Months turned into a year. During that time small things began to change inside our house. Conversations would stop when I entered a room. Financial decisions Daniel and I had always made together suddenly seemed to happen without me. I told myself it was just an adjustment period, the natural discomfort of three adults sharing the same space, but the feeling in my chest kept growing heavier. That night at dinner I finally asked a simple question about a financial transfer I didn't recognize on one of our accounts, and before Daniel could answer, Eleanor placed her napkin neatly beside her plate and gave me a gentle smile that felt strangely rehearsed. "Margaret," she said softly, "sometimes it's best not to assume the worst about people." I remember the way Daniel immediately leaned forward, his voice firm in a tone I had never heard directed at me before. "Mom's right," he said. "You're reading too much into this." For a moment I couldn't speak. I had spent decades supporting Daniel through career changes, financial risks, and every challenge life had placed in our path. Yet there he was defending his mother as if I were an outsider trying to accuse someone in his family. The silence that followed stretched across the table like a crack forming in glass. I looked from Daniel to Eleanor and back again, realizing that something larger was unfolding beneath the surface of that quiet Sunday dinner. What Daniel didn't know, and what Eleanor certainly didn't expect, was that earlier that afternoon I had received a phone call that would soon change everything. A calm voice had introduced himself as Robert Whitman, the attorney who had handled several of the Collins family's legal matters for years. He asked if he could stop by our home that evening because, as he put it, there were a few documents that deserved everyone's attention. At the time I didn't fully understand what he meant. But as I sat there watching my husband defend his mother without hesitation, I realized the timing of that call might not have been a coincidence at all. And somewhere deep inside me, beneath the hurt and confusion, a quiet certainty began to form that before the night was over the truth about our family would finally step into the open. 2 days before that dinner I was standing alone in the quiet kitchen just after sunrise when the phone rang, and I almost did not answer it because most people who call at 7 in the morning are either telemarketers or wrong numbers. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock above the pantry door, and the pale winter light coming through the window made the room look colder than it really was. I had just poured myself a cup of coffee and was staring out at the backyard where the maple trees were still bare from the long Connecticut winter when the phone vibrated against the counter again. Something about that sound made me pick it up. The voice on the other end was calm, steady, and professional. The man introduced himself as Robert Whitman, the attorney who had represented the Collins family for many years. I knew the name immediately. Robert Whitman had helped Daniel's father with estate planning decades earlier, and he had handled several legal documents for our family over the years. He was not the type of man who called casually. When someone like that reached out early in the morning, it usually meant something important had surfaced. He asked if I had a few minutes to talk privately, and something in his tone made my stomach tighten. I stepped into the small sitting room near the hallway so that Eleanor would not overhear the conversation. Since she moved into our house the previous winter, she had developed a habit of appearing unexpectedly whenever Daniel and I spoke about finances or paperwork. At first I thought it was harmless curiosity from an older woman who had too much time on her hands, but over time I began to notice how often she seemed to know about conversations she had never been part of. That morning Robert Whitman spoke slowly and carefully, as if choosing every word with precision. He said there were several documents connected to the Collins family finances that he believed needed to be reviewed in person. I asked him what kind of documents he meant, but he hesitated for a moment before answering. He said it would be better if the conversation happened face to face with everyone present. There was something about the way he said everyone that made my heart skip. I asked him if Daniel knew about the call. Robert Whitman replied that he had attempted to reach Daniel earlier in the week but had not been able to connect with him directly. He said that before making any assumptions he preferred to gather the family together and clarify a few matters that had recently come to his attention. I remember gripping the edge of the kitchen counter as I listened. For the past several months small things had begun to trouble me, details that seemed insignificant at first but slowly started to form a pattern. Statements from our financial accounts occasionally arrived later than usual. A few transactions appeared that I did not immediately recognize. When I asked Daniel about them he would say they were routine adjustments or transfers related to long-term planning for his mother's care. I wanted to believe him because trusting my husband had been the foundation of my entire adult life. Yet each time I asked a question Eleanor seemed to appear nearby with a gentle reminder that Daniel was handling everything responsibly. Robert Whitman finally said something that stayed with me long after the call ended. He said that sometimes families assume they understand their own financial arrangements simply because the same names appear on the paperwork year after year. But according to him paperwork can change quietly over time in ways that not everyone notices immediately. When he finished speaking he asked if our family would be home that Sunday evening. I told him we were planning a regular family dinner as we usually did. He said that would be a good time for him to stop by with the documents he wanted us to see. After I hung up the phone I stood there for several minutes staring at the backyard, trying to decide whether I was overreacting or whether something much larger had been unfolding around me without my knowledge. By the time Sunday evening arrived and I watched Daniel defend his mother at the dinner table with complete certainty in his voice, I realized that Robert Whitman's visit might explain far more than any of us were prepared to hear. I could still feel the weight of Robert Whitman's phone call lingering in my mind as I sat at the dinner table that Sunday evening, watching Daniel defend his mother with a certainty that felt almost rehearsed. The strange part was not simply that he disagreed with me. Daniel and I had disagreed before during our 35 years of marriage, but there was always a sense that we were still standing on the same side of the conversation. That night felt different. It felt as though a quiet line had been drawn across the table, and somehow I had been placed on the opposite side of my own family. Eleanor remained perfectly composed, her posture straight and elegant as she lifted her glass of water with slow, careful movements. Anyone watching from the outside might have assumed she was the calm center of a tense conversation. The wise older woman patiently waiting for the younger generation to settle their disagreements. What they would not have seen were the small details I had begun noticing over the past year. Eleanor had a way of guiding conversations without appearing to guide them. She would ask gentle questions that seemed harmless on the surface but always steered Daniel toward the conclusions she preferred. At first I dismissed it as a mother's influence over her son, something that fades naturally as people grow older. But slowly I began to notice how often Daniel repeated her opinions as if they had been his own thoughts all along. When Eleanor first moved into our home the previous winter, I truly believed it would be temporary. Daniel told me she needed a comfortable place to stay while she decided whether to purchase a smaller home closer to family. I agreed without hesitation because that is what families do for one another. I prepared the guest room, bought new curtains, and even rearranged the small sitting area so Eleanor would have a comfortable place to read in the afternoon. During the first few weeks everything seemed peaceful enough. Eleanor complimented the meals I prepared and often spoke warmly about how grateful she was to have such a welcoming daughter-in-law. Then little changes began appearing like quiet cracks in a wall that had once felt solid. Daniel started having more private conversations with his mother in the evenings after dinner. Sometimes I would walk into the living room and the conversation would suddenly pause before Eleanor offered one of her soft smiles and changed the subject to something harmless like the weather or the neighbor's garden. At first I assumed they were discussing family matters related to her estate or her future living plans. But over time I noticed that some of those conversations seemed to involve financial decisions Daniel and I had always made together. The first moment that truly unsettled me came when one of our quarterly financial statements arrived later than expected. Normally those documents came directly to my email because I had handled the household finances for decades. That time it arrived in a printed envelope addressed to Daniel instead. When I asked him about it he said the bank had simply updated their mailing preferences and that everything was perfectly normal. Eleanor was sitting in the corner of the room knitting quietly when he said it, and I remember how she glanced up briefly with an expression that looked almost amused before lowering her eyes back to the yarn in her hands. Over the following months a few more small details began to accumulate. Certain account notifications stopped appearing in my email. Daniel occasionally mentioned financial planning discussions that I had not been part of. Whenever I tried to ask questions Eleanor would gently remind me that Daniel was managing the situation responsibly and that I should not worry about matters that were already under control. I wanted to believe her because the alternative meant accepting that something was happening inside our own home that I did not fully understand. That was why Robert Whitman's phone call 2 days earlier had unsettled me so deeply. The calm seriousness in his voice suggested that whatever documents he intended to bring to our house that evening were connected to the quiet changes I had been sensing for months. As I sat there watching Daniel defend his mother with unwavering loyalty, I realized that the truth Robert Whitman carried in his briefcase might soon explain why the foundation of my family had begun to feel so unsteady. The silence that followed Daniel's words felt heavier than anything that had been said during dinner, and for a moment no one moved. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway and the soft hum of the dishwasher in the kitchen, small ordinary sounds that suddenly seemed louder than usual because of the tension hanging over the table. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair as if the matter had already been settled, his expression calm but distant, the same expression he used during business meetings when he believed a decision had already been made. Eleanor folded her hands neatly in her lap and looked at me with that same gentle smile she often used when speaking to neighbors or friends, the kind of smile that suggested patience and quiet wisdom. To anyone else it might have looked reassuring, but to me it felt strangely calculated. I took a slow breath and tried to keep my voice steady as I explained again that the transaction I had noticed was not something I recognized. I had been managing the household finances for decades, paying the bills, tracking investments, making sure everything remained organized and transparent. That had always been our arrangement. Daniel focused on his work while I handled the details of keeping our financial life in order. It was a partnership that had worked smoothly for most of our marriage. That was why the sudden appearance of unfamiliar transfers had concerned me enough to ask questions. Daniel responded with quiet confidence that the transfer had been part of a long-term financial adjustment connected to his mother's security and future care. His words sounded reasonable on the surface, yet something about the certainty in his tone made me realize that this explanation had likely been discussed long before that evening. I glanced toward Eleanor again and noticed how carefully she watched Daniel whenever he spoke, as though measuring each word with approval. Over the past year I had begun to recognize that look. It was the same expression she used when Daniel repeated one of her suggestions as if it had been his own idea. The realization made me think back to the months leading up to this dinner. I remembered the afternoon when Daniel mentioned opening a small trust arrangement to ensure Eleanor would always feel secure financially. At the time I supported the idea completely because taking care of family felt like the right thing to do. But I also remembered how Eleanor had insisted that certain details would be easier if Daniel handled them privately through contacts she trusted. She said it was simply more efficient that way. At the time her suggestion sounded harmless, even practical. Yet now as I sat there at the dinner table, I could not ignore the uneasy feeling that those decisions might have quietly shifted the balance of information within our own household. Daniel believed he was protecting his mother and organizing her future with responsibility. Eleanor appeared grateful and supportive, always praising Daniel for being such a thoughtful son. Meanwhile, I had slowly found myself excluded from conversations that once included me naturally. The pattern was subtle enough that I questioned my own instincts more than once. I told myself that families change as circumstances evolve, especially when older relatives move into the home. But the quiet voice in my mind that morning after Robert Whitman called had told me something different. As Daniel finished explaining why the transaction should not concern me, I noticed Eleanor glance briefly toward the front door as if anticipating something. The movement was small, almost unnoticeable, but it sent a strange chill through me. I remembered the calm certainty in Robert Whitman's voice when he said he would bring documents that deserved everyone's attention. At that moment I realized that whatever truth was approaching our dinner table might soon reveal whether the changes inside our family had been innocent misunderstandings or something far more deliberate than any of us had imagined. The quiet tension at the dinner table lingered for several seconds after Daniel finished speaking, and I could feel the weight of his certainty pressing against the calm I was trying so carefully to maintain. I folded my hands together on the table and studied the familiar patterns in the wood grain, reminding myself that Robert Whitman had said he would arrive sometime that evening. The thought of his visit hovered in the back of my mind like a distant storm cloud slowly drifting closer. Eleanor adjusted the sleeve of her sweater and looked toward Daniel with the same composed expression she had worn throughout the entire conversation, the expression of someone who believed the situation was already under control. Daniel reached for his glass of water and took a small sip, clearly expecting the discussion to end there. For a moment I wondered whether I should mention Robert Whitman's call, but something inside me told me to wait. If the attorney was bringing documents important enough to discuss with everyone present, then revealing his visit too early might only complicate matters further. Instead I asked Daniel a simple question about when the trust arrangement had been updated, hoping the answer might clarify the timeline of the changes I had begun noticing. Daniel hesitated briefly before explaining that some adjustments had been made earlier in the year after speaking with financial advisors recommended by his mother. Eleanor nodded approvingly as he spoke, her expression calm and supportive. She added that long-term planning can often involve details that are easier to handle quietly rather than discussing every step with the entire household. Her tone was gentle, almost soothing, yet the words carried an underlying suggestion that my concerns were unnecessary. I listened carefully, remembering the precise wording Robert Whitman had used on the phone when he mentioned documents that deserved everyone's attention. The phrase continued to echo in my thoughts as the minutes passed. The conversation at the table gradually shifted toward safer topics such as neighborhood news and Daniel's work schedule for the coming week. On the surface it looked as though the disagreement had simply dissolved into ordinary family chatter. But beneath that calm surface I could sense the same tension still waiting quietly between us. Eleanor occasionally glanced toward the hallway that led to the front entrance of the house, a small movement that might have seemed meaningless to anyone else. To me it felt like a signal that she was aware of something approaching. I wondered whether Robert Whitman had contacted her as well or whether his visit would come as a surprise. The thought made my pulse quicken slightly. I had known the attorney for many years, and his calm professional manner rarely allowed emotions to show. If he believed a family conversation was necessary, then whatever he carried in his briefcase must be significant. As Daniel stood to clear the plates from the table, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway drifted faintly through the quiet house. It was the kind of ordinary sound that normally would not draw anyone's attention, yet that evening every small detail felt magnified. Daniel paused for a moment as though considering whether we were expecting a visitor. Eleanor's eyes lifted toward the front windows, her expression briefly tightening before returning to its usual calm composure. I remained seated at the table, my hands still folded, sensing that the moment Robert Whitman had mentioned during our phone call had finally arrived. The soft chime of the doorbell echoed through the hallway a few seconds later, and with that simple sound the comfortable routine of our Sunday dinner quietly gave way to whatever truth was about to enter our home. The door opened quietly and Robert Whitman stepped inside, holding a neat leather briefcase in his hand. His presence immediately shifted the atmosphere in the room. The hum of the dishwasher and the faint ticking of the clock seemed to fade into the background as the weight of anticipation settled over the table. Daniel straightened in his chair, a faint tightening around his eyes suggesting he had realized something significant was about to happen. Eleanor's hands rested lightly on the table, the calm composure she had maintained so far remaining in place, yet I could sense a flicker of anticipation in the subtle shift of her posture. Robert nodded politely, greeting each of us with a composed smile that carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to handling delicate family matters. I remained seated, my hands folded in front of me, letting the moment stretch just enough to feel the significance without rushing into it. Robert placed his briefcase on the edge of the table and slowly opened it, revealing a stack of documents neatly organized in folders. He explained in measured tones that these documents pertain to recent changes in financial arrangements and legal designations that have been made in the Collins family over the past few years. His voice was calm and deliberate, allowing each word to be absorbed fully before moving to the next. As he began to lay out the first folder, I noticed Daniel leaning slightly forward, his attention fully captured by the papers and the explanations they contained. Eleanor's gaze remained steady on Robert, her expression inscrutable, yet I could detect the briefest moment of tension in the slight tightening of her jaw. Robert carefully pointed to the documents showing certain transfers and adjustments that had been recorded under names I recognized but with details that I had never been privy to before. I listened intently, tracing the lines of text and numbers with my eyes, feeling a quiet sense of validation begin to rise. This was the evidence I had suspected, quietly accumulating over months, now presented with the clarity and authority that could not be disputed. Daniel's face reflected the same surprise I felt, the realization slowly dawning that some of the assumptions he had made about past transactions and decisions might not have included all the facts. Eleanor's expression remained composed, yet the briefest shadow crossed her eyes as she registered the significance of what was laid before her. Robert Whitman then moved to the next set of documents, explaining how certain instructions had been communicated through channels that excluded me, intentionally or otherwise, and how some of these arrangements had been made without complete clarity for all family members. I kept my tone measured as I responded to his questions, clarifying details where necessary, but also allowing the documents themselves to speak for the truth I had long suspected. The stack of papers continued to grow across the table, each folder revealing further context and detail, quietly unraveling the assumptions that had guided our family interactions over the past year. Daniel exchanged glances with me, a subtle acknowledgment in his eyes that he was beginning to understand the broader picture. Eleanor remained seated with her hands folded, listening carefully, and I could see the first signs of her awareness that the control she had assumed might not be as absolute as she believed. The conversation remained calm, structured, and deliberate, yet each piece of information introduced a subtle shift in the dynamics at the table. I felt a quiet sense of empowerment settling in as I recognized that the careful attention to detail, the documentation I had maintained, and the timing of Robert Whitman's visit were all aligning to reveal the truth. The room, once filled with the quiet tension of uncertainty and unspoken questions, now held a new energy, one defined by clarity, understanding, and the potential for reconciliation built on honesty. I remained seated, observing, absorbing, and knowing that by the end of this evening, the foundation of our family's interactions would be irrevocably realigned, not by conflict or confrontation, but by the calm, undeniable presence of truth. As the evening wore on, I remained seated at the table, quietly observing the subtle shifts in expression and posture that passed between Daniel and Eleanor while Robert Whitman continued to review each document methodically. Each folder revealed details about past transactions, adjustments, and financial arrangements that had been recorded with precision, yet many had not been communicated to me directly. I listened carefully, letting the documents tell the story while my mind connected the dots between the small anomalies I had noticed over the previous months and the explanations now laid out before us. Daniel's initial posture of confidence began to soften slightly, the lines around his eyes deepening as he realized the implications of what he was seeing. Eleanor, on the other hand, maintained a composed exterior, her hands folded neatly in her lap, yet I noticed a brief tightening at the corners of her mouth as she registered the significance of the evidence being presented. Robert Whitman spoke calmly, emphasizing that transparency and clarity were crucial to ensure that all family members understood the current state of affairs, and I found myself nodding silently as he explained the legal and procedural nuances of each item. I felt a quiet sense of validation as the patterns I had perceived independently were confirmed in these documents, demonstrating that my instincts about certain discrepancies had not been unfounded. Daniel shifted in his chair, glancing at me with a mixture of surprise and realization, and I could see that he was beginning to comprehend the broader picture that had eluded him before. Eleanor's gaze remained steady, but there was a flicker in her eyes, subtle yet unmistakable, suggesting that she was reassessing the control she believed she had maintained over the family's arrangements. I continued to observe every reaction with careful attention, understanding that the power of the moment did not come from confrontation but from the undeniable clarity provided by the evidence before us. The calm, deliberate pace set by Robert Whitman allowed the tension in the room to transform into a quiet acknowledgment of truth, and I could feel the subtle shift in family dynamics as each piece of information settled into place. Daniel's earlier certainty had been replaced by a thoughtful contemplation, Eleanor's composed demeanor was now tinged with a recognition of miscalculation, and I, Margaret Collins, felt a steady sense of empowerment that had been absent for months. The room itself, familiar and comforting, seemed to hold its breath as the quiet power of truth unfolded. I did not raise my voice or demand attention, instead, I let the documentation, the careful presentation, and the cumulative weight of months of observation speak for itself. Each page turned by Robert Whitman confirmed my suspicions, connected past patterns, and revealed a family story that had been quietly misaligned without my knowledge. I realized that by remaining patient and attentive, I had positioned myself to witness the unveiling of facts that could not be ignored. The quiet gravity of the moment underscored the significance of preparation, of observation, and of patience in navigating the subtle dynamics of a family that I had loved and nurtured for decades. By the end of the evening, the room had transformed from one of tension and uncertainty to a space where clarity, understanding, and acknowledgment of truth could finally take root, leaving each of us to reckon with what had been revealed in a calm, deliberate, and undeniable way. By the time the last folder had been reviewed and Robert Whitman carefully closed his briefcase, a new quiet had settled over the room, a stillness that felt different from the tense anticipation at the beginning of dinner. Daniel sat back in his chair, his expression thoughtful, a faint crease forming across his forehead as he processed the information that had been laid before him, each detail meticulously documented and presented with the precision of a professional who understood both family and law. Eleanor remained seated, her hands folded, her calm exterior intact, yet I could see the briefest flicker of recognition in her eyes, as though she realized that the carefully constructed assumptions she had relied upon were no longer sufficient to hold the narrative of control she had maintained. I remained quiet, watching, listening, letting each revelation settle naturally without forcing confrontation or argument. The soft clink of the silverware as Daniel adjusted his napkin punctuated the moment, but I paid it no mind, my attention fully on the subtle shifts in energy around the table. Robert Whitman gave a polite nod, indicating that all necessary documents had been presented and that any questions could be addressed directly with him in the following days, but the implication of his presence had already done its work. I felt a quiet sense of accomplishment, not in the form of victory over anyone, but in the clarity that now existed between us, the removal of ambiguity that had shadowed our family interactions for months. Daniel turned his gaze toward me, his eyes meeting mine with a mixture of understanding and the beginning of acknowledgment, as though he was finally seeing the full picture that had been eluding him. Eleanor's expression softened slightly, and I sensed a recalibration of her perspective, a recognition that the assumptions she had made about influence and control might not hold the same weight now that the truth had been presented with such clarity. I kept my voice steady as I addressed the points that required clarification, allowing the documents to speak for themselves while providing context where necessary. Each response, each explanation, reinforced the sense that transparency and honesty were now guiding the conversation, replacing the uncertainty and quiet tension that had defined the past months. I noticed small shifts in posture, subtle exhalations, and brief exchanges of glances between Daniel and Eleanor that indicated a new awareness of the dynamics in our household. The familiar sounds of the home, the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock, and the faint rustle of fabric as we moved in our chairs, seemed to emphasize the Stillness of the moment, a quiet backdrop to the unfolding understanding. I realized then that the evening had accomplished more than simply presenting information. It had allowed each of us to perceive the patterns, the assumptions, and the decisions that had quietly shaped our family life without confrontation or recrimination. By maintaining composure, observing carefully, and allowing the presence of undeniable evidence to speak, I had ensured that the balance of understanding was restored in a way that respected the dignity of everyone present. As Robert Whitman prepared to leave, the air in the room felt lighter, and I knew that this calm, deliberate unfolding of truth had permanently shifted the dynamic between us. Daniel now understood that the perspective I had maintained for months was valid. Eleanor recognized that control based on incomplete assumptions was no longer tenable, and I felt a quiet assurance that patience, observation, and careful attention had brought the clarity that had been missing for so long. The evening closed not with confrontation or loud declaration, but with a shared, silent acknowledgment that the truth had finally been made clear, and with it, a renewed foundation upon which the family could move forward. By the time Robert Whitman left our home, the evening had shifted into a quiet calm that felt entirely different from the tension that had filled the room just hours before. Daniel sat back in his chair, a thoughtful expression softening the lines of certainty that had been there earlier in the dinner, as if he were processing both the documents and the realization that he had misunderstood many of the changes occurring within our family's affairs. Eleanor remained seated, composed as ever, her hands resting neatly on her lap, yet the subtle change in the set of her shoulders suggested that she, too, was absorbing the significance of what had been revealed. I, Margaret Collins, felt a quiet sense of resolution, not in triumph over anyone, but in the clarity that had been established through patience, observation, and the undeniable presentation of truth. The evening had not required raised voices or confrontation. Instead, it relied on the calm, deliberate unfolding of facts that left no room for misunderstanding or assumption. Daniel turned his gaze toward me, his eyes meeting mine with a new level of understanding, a recognition that the concerns I had raised over the past months were legitimate and founded on careful attention to the subtle details that had been quietly overlooked. Eleanor's gaze shifted briefly toward Daniel, then back to me, a small acknowledgment passing between us that the balance of awareness had realigned. The house felt different in that moment, the familiar sounds, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the gentle ticking of the clock, and the faint rustle of fabric as chairs adjusted, emphasizing the weight of the transformation that had occurred without drama or spectacle. I noticed that the atmosphere no longer carried the undercurrent of suspicion that had built over the past months. Instead, there was a mutual understanding, a subtle respect for the clarity that now existed. The documents, carefully reviewed and presented by Robert Whitman, had spoken louder than any argument could have, and the evidence of transparency and procedural accuracy had restored a sense of order within the family dynamic. Daniel spoke quietly, acknowledging the significance of the information and expressing a willingness to review future matters with greater communication and inclusion. Eleanor nodded, her expression calm but reflective, and I realized that the assumptions and influence she had relied upon were now tempered by the recognition of truth and accountability. I felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that patience, attentiveness, and the strategic timing of events had allowed the family to reach this understanding without confrontation or public conflict. The room held a sense of stillness, but it was the kind of stillness that signified a shift in perspective, a foundation now built on clarity and mutual recognition rather than assumption or secrecy. As I rose from the table, the familiar warmth of our Connecticut home felt renewed, not because anything had changed in the structure of the house itself, but because the dynamics within it had been realigned through calm observation and the deliberate revelation of truth. That night, as the house settled into its quiet, I understood that sometimes the most powerful shifts in a family do not come from conflict, but from patience, clarity, and the steady unveiling of what has been hidden, allowing each person to adjust and understand the full scope of the truth without the need for confrontation, and with that understanding, a new sense of equilibrium had been quietly established among us.